20 years after the U.S.-led war in Iraq, we look back on the crisis and the chaos that it caused. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. In March 2003, the U.S. launched a deadly war on Iraq that began with a massive military assault on Baghdad. The attack was followed by a full-scale invasion of the country with strong support from the United Kingdom. The war tore the country apart. It resulted in a massive death toll with estimates in the hundreds of thousands, creating conditions for the emergence of Daesh, also known as ISIL. We begin with this look back from CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
20 years ago, in the wake of the attacks of September 11, 2001, the U.S. began its invasion by launching cruise missiles and laser-guided bombs against leadership targets in Baghdad. Though no weapons of mass destruction, the public rationale for the invasion were ever found, military success at first seemed swift. After toppling, then capturing President Saddam Hussein, there was little post-invasion planning. Iraqi society essentially collapsed. The U.S. banned the former ruling Ba'ath Party and disbanded the Iraqi military, leading to an insurgency that saw U.S. combat deaths spike and the spending of trillions of dollars. Iraqis were angry at the U.S., sectarian divisions marred post-Saddam politics, civil strife led to a crisis bordering on civil war. In December 2008, one Iraqi journalist summed up the anger of many Iraqis by throwing his shoes at then-President George W. Bush. 3 U.S. presidents later, Iraqis still remember the chaos of the U.S. attacks.
During the war, we lived the bombing, gunfire, and explosions with fear and anxiety. We were not comfortable. The situation is now better, and we remember the days of the war, but we hope they're gone for good.
In 2008, U.S. President Barack Obama was elected due in part to the failure of the Iraq War. He called it dumb and vowed to bring U.S. troops home.
Let me say this as plainly as I can. By August 31st, 2010, our combat mission in Iraq will end.
But that created a vacuum quickly filled by ISIS, a radical Islamic group that moved in from Syria and conquered vast amounts of territory, even threatening Baghdad. Some U.S. troops returned, and a bloody counterattack finally pushed ISIS back. The true death toll in Iraq may never be known. Estimates range from 100,000 to more than 1 million dead. In terms of the financial cost, the U.S. estimates range from $1 to $3 trillion, money that could have been spent on roads, schools, railways, and other big neglected projects. 20 years on, the main lesson that doesn't seem to have been learned by the U.S. is having the world's most powerful military that you can deploy around the world at a moment's notice doesn't always yield results. And in fact, here, 20 years on, few people talk about the Iraq War. And even on this anniversary, some voices here in Washington are starting to say, well, it wasn't the disaster it was made out to be. They point to growing GDP figures in Iraq over the last 20 years and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, U.S. troops still remain in the country. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
Time now to have our panel weigh in on all of this. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Raed Jarrar. He is an Iraqi-American who has lived most of his life in Iraq and is now a political advocate. Also with us from London is Abdel Atwan. He is editor-in-chief of Rai-al-Youm. Joining the discussion here in Washington is Becker. He's the executive director of the Answer Coalition. And also with us in Washington is Edmund Ghareeb. He's an academic and Middle East expert. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Raed, you know, when the war began here in the United States, we saw these images. It was called shock and awe, but I imagine if you were living in Iraq, it would probably be termed trauma and terror. Describe for us what it was like for the people on the ground in Iraq, knowing that suddenly they were at war with the United States.
It was truly a shock and awe campaign. I was in Baghdad 20 years ago, and I do remember the first bombs that fell on Baghdad around this time, around March 20th. Iraqis did not view this as a beginning of a new war with the United States, because the U.S. and Iraq were indeed engaged in a military conflict since 1991. January 17th of 1991 witnessed the beginning of the war between the U.S. and Iraq. It actually never ended. So what happened in 2003 was just the beginning of a new phase, a phase where the U.S. and allies were invading the country. So we were all there anticipating this escalation and hiding in bedrooms, in our homes. We dug wells in our backyards and saved food in our fridges. And people were very, very scared. They were very afraid of what's going to happen next.
Talk to us a little bit more about that apprehension leading up to this. And as Bush said, it's going to be at a time of our choosing, as he said. So you really didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. But when it happened, clearly you had to know, boy, this is it, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, everyone was anticipating that the invasion will happen within a few days after the statement that was given by former President Bush. And everyone was fully prepared for it. No one was under an illusion that the Iraqi government that has been dealing with sanctions and bombardments for the past 13 years at the time would have any chance to sustain or protect the country from a foreign invasion led by the US and Britain. So everyone knew that the government will collapse. I even met and saw a few friends and family members who told me that they saw firsthand Iraqi soldiers packing some civilian clothes with them, preparing for the moment where the government collapses and they will just change into their civilian clothes and run away. The spirits were low, morale was low. There was absolutely no confidence that there will be any military resistance to what will happen. But of course, many of us were under the illusion that the war will be civilian friendly. George Bush at the time promised Iraqis that this would be a war fought with smart bombs, that civilians would be spared. To some degree, that did happen in many parts of Iraq, but of course, we came to learn the hard way that there is no such thing as a civilian-friendly war. My neighborhood in Baghdad was bombed heavily. I lived next to the airport, and many of my neighbors were killed and injured. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, the years that followed witnessed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians who were killed and injured, millions who were displaced outside the country. So it was the beginning of a catastrophic event.
Yeah. Brian, let's talk about the rationale for launching the war. President Bush at the time said it was because there were weapons of mass destruction, which we found out later was not true. A lot of people say it was basically about regime change. Others said, maybe it was after Iraqi oil. I mean, as you look back now, 20 years later, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it was a war based on lies, based on deception, calculations that the government knew were untrue. I mean, I was in Baghdad in 1998 when the weapons inspectors were pulled out. That was 2 months after the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a resolution announcing that regime change rather than arms control was the priority for the United States. And during the next 4 days, starting December 12th to 1998, the U.S. bombed the country for 4 straight days, 1,000 bombs and missiles. And as Raed said, that just kept going. I was in Iraq right before the invasion. The U.S. was bombing then. I mean, 13,000 weapons inspections had taken place. The weapons inspectors had no evidence whatsoever of weapons of mass destruction. Not only did the country suffer 13 years of sanctions, 8,000 Iraqis, according to the UN, were dying each month. The country was completely surrounded. It was hobbled. It had no air defenses. The idea that it was a menace to its neighbors or to anybody was clearly a lie. I asked Lawrence Wilkerson once, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, why did you do it? You, the Bush administration, knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. And he said, well, it was low-hanging fruit. So the real goal of the operation, I think, was to create a new Middle East where the U.S. would create proxy governments in these oil-rich, resource-rich parts of the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Libya. You saw what happened afterwards. The war went to Libya, went on to Syria. So it was a regime change war. The U.S. failed, though. It succeeded in creating a lot of human misery and suffering, but these are not actually in Iraq today a puppet government of the United States. This was hubris and arrogance on display. Again, a terrible crime. Sadly, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have not been held accountable. This was a violation of international law, violation of the UN Charter, and yet no one was held accountable.
Abdel, I want you to kind of maybe add to what Brian was just talking about, because can you give us a wider view of things? I mean, we hear about these forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the United States was involved in Syria, Libya. What's the overall takeaway, and what's the mark left behind in the Middle East as a result of these actions?
Well, it is American wars of lies, to be honest. You know, the Middle East lost its faith completely in the Western civilization and the American supremacy, as they call it. You know, the people will never forget what happened in Iraq. 2 million people, at least, were massacred by the sanction, which lasted 13 years, as our guest said previously. And also, about 1 million were killed when the American bombed and invaded and occupied Iraq. Now let us look at the outcome. I believe the Americans wanted to spread, to change regimes and also to spread the constructive anarchy, as Condoleezza Rice said at that time. And they had to start with Iraq. So President Bush, the father and the son, promised that Iraq will be, a oasis of prosperity and stability, and they will impose the democratic, liberal democracy in that part of the world, and Iraq will be a role model for the whole of the Middle East. What happened is completely the opposite. Iraq is still actually anarchy, is still a semi-failed state. There is no government, sectarian division everywhere. Public services is the worst than even the days of sanction. So people in the Middle East saying, look, if the American democracy is like that, we don't want it at all. So even look at the political outcome of that. The United States think that they have a problem with Iraq. Now Iraq is completely surrendered to Iran. Now they have much bigger problem. It is a nuclear problem, which is Iran now. So where is the American plans? Where are their democracy? Where they are thinking or think tanks which are supposed to guide them to better, outcome, like what is happening now? We have dismembered Iraq completely. We don't have a unifying national identity of the Iraqis. It is division, it is sectarian division, it is instability. Islamic State is there in the edges, and we don't know what will happen. And the Iraqi people are suffering, and even, they are looking to the times of Saddam Hussein, the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, as I met many people telling me that at least 90% of the Iraqis are really longing to that days, not because they like democracy, but because they hate what is happening now in their own country.
Okay, Edmund, let me ask you about this. George W. Bush making, Iraq part of his war on terror following 9/11. Was this basically his effort and other hardliners like Rumsfeld and Cheney to basically take out Saddam Hussein? A lot's been written about that. What's your take?
Well, there's no doubt that there were a number of factors behind this, but one of the most influential groups in the United States were the neoconservatives, who emerged in the 1990s and began to basically push for a hardline position at that time, and that they believed that the United States must bring about change, regime change in a number of countries in the Middle East, in part to help protect Israel, on the other part also to maintain U.S. hegemony in the region and on the international level. In fact, this is what, if we go back and try to see what they wanted to do, basically they said they were going to bring democracy to Iraq, they were going to bring the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they were going to end Iraq's control of nuclear weapons of mass destruction, which the whole story was fabricated, and bring an end to Al-Qaeda, which they said Iraq was involved in it as well. They also wanted to have control over Iraq's oil. Rupert Murdoch talked about the price of oil as a result of the invasion of Iraq is going to be about $20 a barrel, and this would be a great development. The United States, of course, did not need the oil, but the U.S., it was important for the U.S. to have a foothold in a strategic country in the region, which is also rich in oil. And that would be very important, not only for the U.S., but more importantly for the allies of the United States. So these were just some of the issues that the U.S. raised, but many of them were, in fact, especially the issue of the support for Al-Qaeda, the issue of weapons of mass destruction, were fabrications. And basically, this was known at the time, even if we go back to the Bureau of of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, they had a different perspective than the CIA. President Cheney made several visits to the CIA to influence the reports that were coming about the weapons of mass destruction. Prime Minister Blair talked about how the Iraqis could threaten Britain, threaten the world within 45 minutes. I think what we saw, perhaps the best explanation of what has happened, and that might give us an idea what's going on. There was a book recently published by an Iraqi author by the name of Ahmad Saadawi. He called it Frankenstein in Baghdad. And he said many Americans believed that they had liberated the Iraqis from fear. Instead, they opened the gates of hell to previously unknown horrors. Around 2006, 2007, I attended a conference in Washington at which actually a talk by General William Odom, who was the former head then of the National Security Agency. And I asked him about his assessment as of now of the Iraq War. And what he said was, he said, this is one of the worst disasters in our modern history. I mean, this was from someone like General Odom. That was quite a statement at that time. So basically what we have seen, as the other guests have mentioned, is that Iraq was destroyed. Iraq was probably one of the most important Arab countries. It had made important gains, had a large middle class, technologically advanced, relatively speaking. It had free education, free medical care. And Iraq, since the time of the invasion and its aftermath, we saw the increase in sectarianism. We saw actually the Lebanonization of Iraq. You have now, like in Lebanon, you have the president who's a Kurd, you have the prime minister who's a Shiite, you have the speaker of the parliament who is a Sunni. So Iraq was shattered, and it continues to face many problems. 2 days ago, on the 18th, the Washington Post reported how there were numerous burn pits in Iraq, where basically we saw human waste, we saw medical waste, we saw some munitions were all burnt, and they sent a poisonous cloud all over Iraq. And many Iraqis, many American soldiers were affected by this. Now, we can say one thing, that the United States, yes, succeeded in bringing down a regime that it considered hostile to the U.S., to the American interests in the region, and to Israel. But the military victory was not translated to a political victory. That's where the failure clearly emerged.
Well, Raed, let me ask about that, because there was an op-ed in the Washington Post from the former Baghdad bureau chief who said, look, the U.S. made two strategic mistakes right away, which was de-Baathification and basically firing everybody in the Iraqi war, or the army, I should say. Ill-conceived approaches that they really didn't have a plan post-war of what to do, and what they did was create chaos. Can you talk about what that did in Iraq and the lingering effects that we're seeing today as a result of it?
I mean, actually, I do think that the U.S. made catastrophic mistakes. I don't think there were just two. And I would also question the premise of the statement that these were quote-unquote mistakes. We actually don't know the actual plan, whether the plan was to create chaos, like your other guest, Abdel Atwan, just said, or whether there was no plan and everything was just going off rails because of lack of planning. These are things that we're still asking the questions to date, 20 years after the invasion. Why did the invasion happen, and what was the plan behind it? But at the time, there was definitely chaos. After the U.S. invaded Iraq and the fall of the Iraqi government on April 9th, the U.S.-led coalition took very strong steps that dismantled the Iraqi state. Iraq used to be a socialist country, so almost everything in Iraq was run by the government. Education, healthcare, all of the major systems were run by the state. And those parts were dismantled. The Iraqis were really confused at the time. Why would the US dismantle the civic parts of the government if it was truly coming here to create a safe haven to improve the country? So in addition to what you mentioned, to dismantling the Iraqi armed forces and to creating a system of de-Baathification where millions of Iraqis were excluded from participating in the rebuilding of the country, there were other steps taken to privatize and sell parts of the government. There were other steps taken to not protect very vital parts of Iraq's infrastructure from looting and destruction in the weeks that followed the invasion. So as a result, a few months into the invasion, by the summer of 2023, the entire infrastructure in Iraq was gutted. There was nothing. There was no one behind the wheel anymore. The country was in complete free fall. And of course, as you would imagine, we started having armed militias emerge to fill the void that was created by the destruction of the state. So, we ended up with groups like ISIS or ISIL or Al-Qaeda or other Shia militias that were sometimes even worse than Al-Qaeda, Kurdish militias, Christian militias. These were symptoms of the problems, and predictable results of the recipe that was introduced to Iraq in 2003.
Yeah,
you remove the central government, you introduce sectarian politics, of course you're going to end up with sectarian militias and terrorist groups.
Yeah, predictable, as you say. Brian, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2004 declared explicitly that the U.S.-led war on Iraq was illegal. I know you were part of the anti-war movement. I'm sure you must have been feeling pretty good about those comments, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Talk to me about the movement, what it was like early on, and the cost of this war, not just in terms of the cost in lives, but also the actual financial cost. As Nathan pointed out, schools, roads, so many things that could have been invested in, that money went elsewhere.
Right, and elsewhere means basically to U.S. military contractors. I mean, when you talk about spending trillions, $1 or $2 or $3 trillion on Iraq, most of that money is not going to Iraqis, it's going to U.S. arms manufacturers. I mean, it started on October 26, 2002. The Answer Coalition organized a demonstration in Washington of 200,000. And then on January 18, 2003, we had 500,000 here in Washington, D.C. On February 15th, 35 million people around the world, about 10 million Americans were in the streets. I think part of what was going on was that the Bush administration was racing towards war because the world was against the war. Only the UK government, only the Tony Blair government basically was, and Israel, of course, was standing with the United States. And most of the American people were against the war. The Congress was getting calls 300-1 against an invasion. This has been partly rewritten. But the U.S. media, the mainstream media, in the last month before the war, everything shifted. You had retired generals and admirals and colonels now becoming the commentators on all the cable news networks, promoting the idea that war was inevitable. And one of the things that they tried to do and did do successfully at first was, as Raed said, end the war quickly. The government in Baghdad broke apart and fled April 9th, 2003 after 3 weeks. So George W. Bush could get up on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier in early May. They pulled the aircraft carrier out from its base in San Diego for the photo op and then stood under a big banner that said mission accomplished. Meanwhile, the U.S. was setting up torture centers like Abu Ghraib. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were made unemployed. Millions were made refugees. Hundreds of thousands, according to the Lancet Medical Journal, by 2010 had died. This was the mission. This was mission accomplished. And again, George W. Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld, they got a pass. The U.S. media treated them as sort of mistaken figures. No, these were criminal acts. These are crimes against humanity. These are crimes against peace, which at the Nuremberg trial was the greatest of all crimes that the Nazis were convicted of.
Edmund, let me ask you about this. It was a Republican president who launched the war, as we know, but it was a Republican president not too long ago, Donald Trump, who gave a commencement address at U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he said, "We are ending the era of endless wars," saying it's not the job of American forces to solve ancient conflicts in faraway lands that many people have not even heard of. Is that the lasting legacy of all of this, that perhaps this kind of military interventionism from the United States in the Middle East is over?
One would hope so, but I think the reality may be something else altogether different. We still see the United States continues to have a military presence in Iraq. The U.S. has a presence in Syria, a legal presence, because it violates international law. We see the theft, actually, of Syrian resources, oil, grains, etc. And at the time, we see harsh sanctions imposed on the country. We continue to see, actually, one of the promises, or one of that we heard once in a while from U.S. officials at the time, that the war also is going to help bring about a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But in fact, we continue to see this conflict emerge. We saw also, and this is where I think something very significant has happened. We saw the continuation of the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan. We saw that the war before in 1999, the war on Yugoslavia. All these wars, we see now also the expansion of NATO towards the borders of Russia, which led to this current war that we are witnessing now, which is a terrible war that the Russians are paying a price. The Ukrainians are paying a heavy price as well. And this raises a question. The United States paid, according to a study that was done by two professors, Stiglitz and another professor from Harvard University, and they said that the cost of the wars, these wars, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Libya, these costs close to $10 to $11 trillion, and the cost is rising. So unfortunately, we still see this policy which has brought about these interventions, which basically were aimed at maintaining U.S. supremacy and unipolar world. But I think that what we saw in Iraq and the results of the Iraq war may have in fact changed the equation and began to push the world in a different direction towards a multipolar world, especially with the rise of China and the return of Russia.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for your analysis and your perspectives. Certainly very insightful. Really appreciate it. And that's going to do it for us here. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.